5 is probably one of the most unique vessels on the west coast of the United States. It is an absolute living museum. Every time we take the ship out, we truly do turn another page of Northwest history.
The Virginia 5 is the last remaining wooden steamship, passenger, propeller-driven vessel of its kind in the western United States. It's very unique.
There's just something weird and satisfying about being on a 100-foot-long antique, just screaming down the waterways. Sort of an awe-inspiring experience of just, I can't believe I'm actually doing this.
Virginia 5 is a National Historic Landmark. It is one of only 2 vessels of its type still in operation in the continental United States that is a wooden hull, propeller-driven steamship.
We're very proud of the Virginia 5 as the last of the steam-powered Mosquito fleet, which is absolutely and historically correct. But really her significance far exceeds what that regional status alone tells you, because well over 100 years' time, from the early 1800s up until the 1930s, all over coastal United States there were ships like this that performed in a trade exactly like this. But there are only 2 out of thousands that remain as living ships. This is one of them.
Probably the most interesting feature of the Virginia 5 is the reciprocating steam engine, which is in back of me. And there are very few steam-powered vessels, period, in the United States, and even fewer with reciprocating engines. I think it's important to keep something like this going, just from a historical standpoint, because they aren't making them anymore.
The ship has just history behind it. It's probably one of the very few places in the country where you can actually see a working steamboat in operation. You really have a hard time finding something as unique as the Virginia 5 to go out on. And it's just a heck of a lot of fun to take out.
Virginia 5 is the sole representative now of the Mosquito fleet, which was once mass transportation on Puget Sound before there was roads and automobiles everywhere. And we need to keep something around to remind us of that. It was a different way of life, more leisurely way of life than we have now.
The people in Seattle and Tacoma needed to move product or people between the various cities. So what these boats did, they were called the Mosquito fleet. Some guy looked out on Elliott Bay about 1880 and said they look like a bunch of mosquitoes out there, so therefore it was called the Mosquito fleet.
Well, we often say that the Virginia 5 was built to connect Tacoma and Seattle, and that's correct, but really the importance of the Virginia 5 was to connect the small communities of the west side of Vashon Island with the endpoint cities. To understand the significance of the Virginia 5, I think it's worthwhile to take yourself back in time. You grew up on an island like Vashon Island in a little community there whose primary communication with the rest of the world was by way of steamboat. You can get some idea of what that was like. If you were going to go to the city, you went on a ship like the Virginia 5. Maybe you had hens or berry patches to augment the family income. If you had those products had to get to market, they would go on the decks of a ship like this. Maybe you wanted to get some new kitchenware or splurge on a new set of dishes. You didn't go online to Amazon.com to order something or hop in the car and go to the local discount department store. You got it from the Sears catalog. That came by mail. It came on decks like these, on the decks of a ship like this. So in many ways, these ships in their era were kind of a combination of what we might call a Metro bus and a UPS truck today.
Nels Christensen was the starter of the West Pass Transportation Company. He lived on the west side of Vashon Island, which is called Covos Passage, also known as West Pass. And he wanted to find a reliable way of getting farmers with their produce from Tacoma to Seattle and service the towns on Vashon Island and the Kitsap Peninsula.
The Christensen family started out with one little tiny boat, the Virginia One. They bought succeedingly larger vessels, 2, 3, 4, for the run on the west side of Vashon and the east side of the Kitsap Peninsula from Tacoma to Seattle.
Virginia 5 was built by a Norwegian shipbuilder on a beach without plans. It was the first one built by the West Pass Transportation Company from scratch. Previously, they had bought old boats and renamed them the Virginias, 1, 2, 3, and 4.
The ship was built on a beach in Covos Passage, a town called Maplewood, just a little south of Olalla. And the town doesn't exist anymore. It was across the Covos Passage from what is now Lisa Beulah Park in Vashon.
Liza Beulah was a postal drop box and then became an actual post office. And the reason it was called Liza Beulah, guess why? Liza and Beulah were the two women who ran the post office. So the mailman, in keeping things simple, he called it Liza Beulah Washington.
Ships have always been christened by, a beautiful woman smashing a bottle of champagne against the bow of the ship, but that didn't happen on this ship. The Virginia 5 was christened with spring water because it was christened at a time during Prohibition. So that was a unique little tidbit about the ship. The engine, it's a triple expansion, double action, reciprocating steam engine. And it was state-of-the-art engine technology in the 1800s. This engine was originally installed in the Virginia 4, which was a ship called the Tyrus. And it was taken out of the 4 and reinstalled in the Virginia 5 in 1921. So the engine is quite a bit older than the ship is.
The engine was built at a small machine shop down here on the Seattle waterfront, Heffernan Engine Works. And it was installed in the steamer Tyrus in 1906. And it was a handmade engine when it was built, and it's still like that. It's a triple expansion engine, what we call triple expansion, because the high pressure steam is expanded in stages to lower pressures in larger cylinders and continues to do work in the engine before it exhausts into the condenser. The concept was invented in about 1880 to enable steamships to compete with sailing ships at sea and burn less fuel than they had been burning before with more primitive low-pressure engines.
It's a pretty happy little engine. Beautiful piece of technology. Incredibly hypnotizing. You go and look at it for a long time. A large cluster of people will come down here and no one says anything. Everyone's just enthralled by this engine, and it's a beautiful thing. There's just a lot of working parts. It's fun to look at, and this engine seems to have a little bit more heart and soul to it. And it seems more of like a living being, just in terms of how many pieces are moving on it and how exposed all the inner workings are.
The one thing about the Virginia 5, which is completely different than any other boat you will be on, is that we have absolutely no control over the engine from the wheelhouse. The only thing that we can do is turn right and left. We use the engine order telegraph right behind me to signal down to the chief engineer, who then has to change the speed or direction of the engine.
Back in the 1920s and 30s. We steered with manila rope. and there was no power steering at all. Also, she didn't have a telegraph in those days. She had a gong and jingle, the bell pulls on the wheel stand. One bell was slow ahead, or a jingle and 2 bells, slow astern. And that's how we did it.
And then we have our 2 whistles pull cords here. The red one is for our 2 whistles that are on the smokestack back here.
Those steam horns are tuned to a particular sound, and people would know which boat was coming in and what time that boat would be at the dock, give or take a few minutes, and what time that boat would leave for shore, give or take a few minutes.
I'll never forget the whistle. And even today, to hear that whistle in the distance, I mean, I was out in my backyard and I heard it, and it's like a dog hearing its master's voice. I just immediately perked up and I thought, that's the Virginia V, and I would recognize it anywhere.
There was a big storm in 1934, and that storm almost did the ship in. The ship was returning to dock at the ferry landing at Olalla. A bad storm kicked up, and Captain Christensen needed to disembark his passengers. And he docked the ship successfully, and everyone got off. And then the storm got worse and worse and just battered the ship against the dock and significantly damaged it. The entire cabin, the entire house, and everything was crumpled and crushed on the starboard side. And that alone was almost enough to do in the Virginia 5, but they were able to rebuild it, but that storm almost ruined it.
By the late 1930s, all of the New Deal programs had built roads, and more people had cars and trucks, and it was more efficient to move your cargo by truck than it was to use a ship. So the ship had to find other ways to survive. World War II, it was drafted to haul shipyard workers from Seattle to Bremerton. That was one of its very busy times. By that time, much of the Mosquito fleet had worn out and disappeared and been decommissioned. The Virginia 5 was one of the few available resources to get people around. It was still faster to take an hour on Virginia 5 to go to Bremerton than to drive around. And Galloping Gertie had collapsed by then, so. One of the things that it did to support itself was haul campfire girls to the camp on Vashon Island from either Seattle or Tacoma. About 1 million campfire girls went to camp on the Virginia 5.
I was aboard the Virginia 5 starting when I was about 8 years old, going to Camp Sealth, and it was just magic.
It was a big deal. I mean, it was an adventure. You waited all year for this adventure to get on the Virginia V and to go over to Camp Sealth. I marked the days off the calendar, and finally the day came. And the boat, when we were small, looked huge. I mean, it looked immense.
We welcome you to Camp Sealth. We're mighty glad you're here. We'll spend the air reverberating with a mighty cheer.
And they'd start right away the minute you got on board with singing songs and taking care of the kids that maybe got a little homesick. But why would anybody get homesick when they were on such a fantastic adventure?
I remember singing a lot. Everybody seemed to have musical instruments. I had a banjo, which I couldn't play very well, and we had ukuleles and lots of guitars. So we sang a lot.
Most everyone that rode the Virginia 5 called it the Virginia V.
I remember some friends talking about the Virginia 5, and I literally didn't know what they were talking about. I said, well, I used to go on the Virginia V. And then they looked at me like, well, duh, it's the same thing. I was like, oh yeah.
And it was so much fun to just be able to stand up in the bow and just let the wind run through your hair. And just smell the salt water and just know that you were heading off on a great adventure.
So what's important is the vessel has to be kept up. It's a wooden ship. The wood ship deteriorates every day. It's an organic material. It's wood.
It's pretty great that we've been able to save this one, and it took a lot of dedication. Over the years, the Virginia 5 got run down a little bit. So in 1997, we started a very long restoration project that took 5 years.
In 1996 and 1998, the good people of Seattle came up with almost $8 million to rebuild the 5 from the waterline up.
The first part of it was to do hull work and do some minor repairs to the machinery, and then we took pretty much everything out of the boat machinery-wise, including the boiler. We put the new boiler back in and finished up the machinery space. Went back in service the end of June of 2002.
This wheelhouse that we're in right now was built by the students at Seattle Central Community College in their Maritime Woodworking Department, and this wheelhouse is almost exactly as you would find it in 1922. So it was one of the most unique restorations in the Pacific Northwest. When we took her out of the shipyard over at Lake Union Dry Dock, she was, and still is, the queen of the Northwest as far as I'm concerned. Currently what we do is we do quite a bit of weddings, we do corporate charters, we do significant birthdays, significant anniversaries. I have just completed doing my 128th wedding on board, and it is quite fabulous.
The good news is that this vessel has a lot of people on board that care very passionately for this boat. We are getting a lot more interest just from younger generations that are coming on board and just finding this to be the coolest thing they've ever seen.
The skill set required, especially in the engineering, is disappearing art completely. There are no more steamships pretty much in the U.S. to learn from or retire from. It is tough. Most of our engineers are retired in their 60s and 70s. So when they decide not to come down or it's not fun anymore, that lost art will be gone. It is not something taught, and we have to pretty much teach everybody hands-on.
And it's just a fun thing to do. I've got the best hobby job in the entire world. I've got the biggest toy. I've already won.
This is probably my 4th time on the Virginia 5. And what I liked most about this was just the history that's being preserved with this ship. I mean, steam power itself was one of the things that built this country. And having something that's a working 100-year-old plus steam engine on the Virginia 5 is absolutely mind-blowing to me.
This vessel is the last of the Mosquito fleet. I would say that for purposes of history, the Mosquito fleet was as important, if not more so, than today's computers and everything else we are to the Northwest's growth.
I hope that young guys take an interest in the boat and replace us and then keep up the work of keeping her up. There'll always be shipyards. There'll always be wood to rebuild the ship from, and it just takes money and gumption and dedication.
Well, I hope that we can keep her in operation, because that's what really distinguishes her from any other maritime historic artifact, is that she's still a living ship, and that's extraordinary.
She survived this long. As long as there's people who love the ship in general, then it will survive. And if anything, we know there's a lot of people that love this boat and have put in many, many hours to keep it happy. Would not be surprised that in 90 or more, you'll still see this engine, you'll still see this boat in some way or another just traveling around. It was classy when it was built, it's classy now, it's going to stay that way.